if you can't break out above the noise, then you're going to have a really great product that no one's ever heard of.
Right.
And most of the companies that we see, unsurprisingly, there's a bunch of people who are building the same types of products, same types of ideas. They're like more or less like, interchangeable. And so a lot of times the distinction on them is like, how effectively can they get both people as customers to give them attention and follow what it is that they're doing, and people as teammates and employees to give them attention and choose to join their cause, right? Like, we kind of deal with primarily one form of constraint, which is like the financial capital constraint that a company runs into, more money. And a little bit of the human capital constraint, which is like, okay, now you have money, you need to go hire some people. Who should you be hiring, right? So we can help a little bit with number two. We help a lot of it with number one. If the founder can't cover the ground on the remainder, then they're kind of dead in the water. You can give them all the money in the world. They can't get people to join them or pay attention to them, or get customers to see them as, a solution that's head and shoulders above the competition. They're dead in the water.
Yeah.
And so you have to pay a lot of attention to that.
Do you think that perhaps, I guess, and I'm sure from, on a case to case basis, like people have to understand what are your attention assets in your own space, right? Because, for example, everyone starting a podcast, everyone doing YouTube, is not a great way to do that, for so many founders, right? It's like, because maybe the most important asset to have to get attention is perhaps I guess what they would call in like the med device space, like a KOL, or something like that, so, like kind of like a cosign or a sign up or a particular relationship or whatever the case may be. So it's like you said, diving deep into the noise without being thoughtful about like what attention you actually need and what's the most efficient way to get that attention is like, I think, a real trap right now for some people who are coming up.
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time with this like very exceptional author, just like learning more about that space, because when you think about books, it's like almost the proverbial commodity. There's like so many books that are written, and the number of books that sell over 10,000 copies is like 0.001%. Right. In fact, I think in 2023, the Wall Street Journal like published this report on like best reads of the year and like reading stats. And basically, if you read 2 books through the course of the year, you were in the top 0.1% of readers for the US, right? And so like, it's a great example of like, how do you actually break out in this thing that's existed for the last 6,000 years as far as an art form? And it turns out that, at least the theory from this artist, is a lot of it comes down to the introduction. Just like, have you spent enough time and energy and thought to like understand like why you should have space in people's day, in their mind, in their reading time, versus just like, oh, I have something I want to say.
Right.
Which I think is where I would have started. That's what I want to say, right? Like, who cares? If you want to hear it, great. If not, it's their problem.
Right, exactly.
And it turns out, I think, if you look at all of the great sort of attention grabbers, they kind of reverse engineer what people want to hear. I mean, Trump is like the king of this, right?
Absolutely.
He says, okay, what's going to get people fired up and pay attention to me? I know. I'm considering running for a third term. Everybody's like, this is absolutely absurd. This is ridiculous. Of course, this cannot happen. Like, he can't really be serious about this. There's no way. But the news coverage for the last 3 days has all been on Trump saying he might possibly, wink, wink, hypothetically run for a third term. Like, let's go ask all these senators, what do they think about Trump's third term? Like, and I have to imagine like that was the goal. Whether or not he actually decides to try to do this thing is irrelevant. Like, he's dominated the attention, like, sort of a junkyard pit bull. Like, he's grabbed onto it and he's not letting it go. And, so anyways, like, I think the way that you have to break out is you have to understand what it is that your audience wants to hear. And I think that requires a sense of humility in surveying the landscape of what's already there. And a lot of folks don't do that. They just kind of jump into the conversation when they haven't really listened to what everyone else has said before they raise their hand.
Right. Tell me a little bit about your experience, like building a company in the 2010s, and then like what you're seeing now as an investor, as the frame of the environment that founders are building in today.
Totally. So I think the general trend has actually been pretty consistent, right? Which is an inversion where it's becoming easier to start a company and sort of get through the early innings, but becoming like significantly harder to grow it after you've started it. So if you think about like our early days in creating Fango and sort of what would become restaurant-facing technology at Grubhub, the early days were really hard because we had to rack our own servers. Like we had to build all of our software basically from scratch or from like libraries. You just didn't have a lot of things that you could call on to like help expedite that process or to reduce the cost. And it meant that like you spent a lot of money and time and energy in the early days of like just getting going, just getting approved, getting registered, getting your licenses, like getting access to this API, like buying servers off of eBay, racking them, configuring them, building the backend software, like standing up your integrations, hosting all of these things. We hosted our own websites. And you needed to have uptime for that. You needed to have battery backups for the servers. Like nothing could go down. And the flip side of it, though, was if you could do all of those things, then the competition was relatively limited on the other side because there weren't a lot of folks who could make it past that initial speed bump. And so it meant that acquiring folks on, Google was really easy and cheap. Getting a user on Facebook was like 4 or 5 tenths of a penny. And if you fast forward to today, it's probably $50 or $60 to acquire a user on Facebook, right? And at the same time, it's so much easier to start a website, right? You can just go on to Shopify and like find some stuff on Alibaba, drop ship it from Alibaba through Shopify to, some user, and Uber or DoorDash or Better Trucks will deliver it for you. And you have your whole business in, 3 or 4 hours and a couple of clicks on your computer without ever leaving your home. The challenge, though, is you're competing against 10,000 other drop shippers who are doing the same thing and are also selling fidget spinners or whatever it is that's hot at the time. And so I think that generative AI is, again, moving along the same trend. It's just probably more of an accelerant where, again, if you have an idea for an iPhone app, you could go into a Bolt or you could go into a Lovable today and just describe the app that you want to build. You could go into a subframe and like build a UI just by talking to a chatbot. You could build the entire back end. You could push it to, production through Vercel. You could then go and generate some marketing copy, through ChatGPT or through Claude, and then push that out, or Purposely AI, push that out to any of the advertising platforms. And in the same way, like stand up a business. The interesting piece is that I think the common denominator across all of these trends, though, is still like drive and motivation. Because like even though you can do all that stuff infinitely easier than you could, like there's still a ton of people who are like, that seems like work. Like I'd rather just keep doing what I'm doing. And I think that's always going to be the biggest competition. It's like literally just effort and like tenacity. And whether it's tenacity that's being applied to like figure out how to rack a server and, stand up a back end, or whether it's the tenacity to like go and learn these tools or to go and discover them and put them into use. If you don't have that underlying drive, then you're just not in the game. And I think that's probably what keeps most people out of taking advantage of what's happening with generative AI or other technologies, more so than like the technology being a limiting factor.
That's really interesting. Why do you think that would be, I guess, the standard today where, as barriers come down, you would think that would increase the supply of things. So. But like you said, they're dropping the cost essentially of knowledge to zero, right? The level of effort and tenacity and ultimate knowledge that it took for you all to build what you built in the 2010s, significantly reduced. So you would think like, okay, well now that just means founders are going to be popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
The level of companies are going to increase significantly. But like you said, what do you think prevents people ultimately, even with low barriers, from getting into the space, competing, trying to build something, even though it's probably one of the best times to build?
I have probably two thoughts about this, kind of thinking about it as we're talking about it. So one would be, like, I think the relative, like, bounitude of new solutions and options for folks have made things so good that your drive to change things can get depressed. Right? So, like, when things were really crappy, because there like weren't a lot of good solutions out there, or good enough solutions out there, you're like really motivated to change things because the status quo is like quite painful. Like, you just, like, when we were thinking about letting people order food from their phones, it was like, what was your option otherwise? You get in the car, you drive somewhere, you wait in line for half an hour, place your order, then wait for another half an hour for them to make it, get the food, drive back home, sit down, wash your hands, like, then eat. Well, that sounds miserable, right? And so in many ways, like, we solved that problem because we had to. Like, it just felt like an untenable situation to allow it to exist that way. If you fast forward to today, is DoorDash perfect? Is Grubhub perfect? Or Order Ahead or Caviar or Uber Eats? Like, no, they're almost sufficiently good that you're like not really motivated in the same ways. Like, it's not perfect, but it ain't bad. And relative to where it was 4 or 5 years ago, you say to yourself, like, it's moving in the right direction. I don't need to intervene. And so I think a lot of the industries and other opportunities, they get kind of quashed that way, like where people look at the landscape and say, it's not bad enough for me to decide to change it or do something about it. I think on the other side is a general, like, demotivation of the population that we have all been trained now to look for things to happen very quickly and very easily. If you're hungry, you push a button and like someone will get in the car and deliver it to you. If you want to watch your favorite television show, you push a button and it shows up on your TV or on your computer screen. If you are bored and sitting at a bus stop, then you push a button and someone will come and dance and entertain you on TikTok. And we look at our whole lives through this lens. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, in business, the really valuable things, they take a lot of time and they take a lot of energy to build. And there's a tremendous number of people in the world who just, that desire in them has been squashed. It's been crushed by just repeated engagements with instant gratification, with food and entertainment and television, you name it. And so one of the things I think that we do in this like firm, and I have to do a lot personally, is like embrace really hard shit. Like, you have to make it a habit of doing hard, painful, annoying things. Like, exercise is one of those things. Like, not because you're trying to go win an Olympic, medal or anything along those lines, but because it's hard and it's cold and it's early in the morning and you don't want to do it. And if you push yourself to get through it, then the rest of the day is a very small ask of your sort of dopamine drive relative to that like first step of doing the really hard thing or starting off the really hard thing. I think cold plunges are like that. A lot of people get up early in the morning. The first thing they do is like go and get in miserably cold water, because it basically makes the rest of the day so much easier and so much more pleasant, right? As a function of what you just did. And so I think you have to practice doing hard things, and then, entrepreneurship and being a founder becomes a much more manageable endeavor.
Yeah. Honestly, I really appreciate how thoughtful you are, man, to be honest. And it sounds like you think, about things sometimes, which is quite a compliment, man. It's like everybody doesn't sound like that.
Yeah, I do spend an inordinate amount of time thinking. It's a very strange thing saying,
yeah,
because it's so counter to like the way I grew up in a way. Well, I won't say it's counter to how I grew up. It's counter to the world I observed growing up, because most of my family was blue collar, like my grandparents, my uncles, where, you walk a beat as a cop, or you cut hair as a barber, or you farm. And like nobody really cared what you knew. No one was going to pay you to just sit around and think about stuff.
Right.
Think things up. It was like, you got paid on how many acres of land you plowed, or, how many folks you arrested or heads you cut. And so it is still something that feels very privileged to me to like be compensated and valued in a society on the basis of what you think, how fast you think, and to what extent what you think diverges from what everybody else knows. Anyways, it's always surprising.
No, absolutely. And where are you from again?
We're originally from New Hampshire.
Okay.
So I was born in New Hampshire when my parents were in grad school at Dartmouth. And then we moved to Maryland, which is where my parents had originally come from. They come from Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh, okay. Excellent. And then you went down to Georgia Tech.
I went to Georgia Tech.
Right. Yeah.
That Jermaine Dupri, like Welcome to Atlanta song had just come out. And I was obsessed with Atlanta.
Yeah.
For some reason, I thought that going to Georgia Tech was going to be commensurate with like sort of the Jermaine Dupri,
that's like
112.
Yeah.
Life.
So deaf at Georgia Tech.
It was nothing like that. Absolutely nothing like the music videos. I was basically catfished for college.
That's hilarious.
But
that's so funny. If you could do it over again, Morehouse maybe?
Maybe. I had a lot of really good friends from Morehouse. Actually, my best friend went to Morehouse, and he was a dual degree between Georgia Tech and Morehouse. And the thing I always struggled with Morehouse was like, I have such a fascination with like diversity, and not just like skin color diversity, but just like diversity of thought, diversity of experiences, foods, like, and in many ways, this is, I think, where a lot of the big insights come from. Like if you think about, the discovery of CRISPR, there was a woman named Jennifer Doudna who, like, helped lead that project. The underlying discovery there was a series of bacteria that would basically use splicing in order to disable the replication of viruses. So virus would try to infect bacteria. The bacteria would say, nope, I'm going to cut your DNA and prevent you from replicating. And it just so happened that we discovered this. It said like, I wonder if we could use this to cut the DNA of some other molecule or some other, animal. And thus, like the discovery of CRISPR. There's a study going on right now that has found a protein that exists in the tip of the tongue of, a lizard that, has the potential to cure Alzheimer's. All of these things are like, they are at the intersection of many like different disciplines. My grandmother, she would spend a lot of time, like letting my grandfather's pants out as he would get older and like get a little bigger. And, I remember asking her once, like, why do you always, cut the pants sort of, along the seams and along the lines? And she says, because that's where the growth happens. Like that's where the stretch is. And it's very similar, I think, as we like think about sort of knowledge and we think about innovation and insights. Like the growth is happening at the intersection where these two pieces of fabric meet, where these two cultures meet, where these two, musical genres or food, taste meet.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that you can immerse yourself in that, you're always going to be in the know of like where the new stretch is happening, where the new growth is happening. And the thing I always felt with Morehouse was that it became kind of its own ecosystem. It was kind of insular. And I think that works really well for a lot of people. And like the school has a long and storied history of graduating exceptional like people. And at the same time, I really appreciated being in a dorm where like the guy above me was a refugee from Bosnia and like the person next door, his dad was a CFO from India. And he had like, he had gone to like Georgia Tech as basically a backup school because of the IIT system. And so anyways, I wouldn't give that experience up.
Yeah.
But man, I think they might have had more fun.
It'd be really interesting to hear about your area of focus in investing, which is SaaS, what you historically have looked for in SaaS companies and how things have evolved, and now it's like totally. AI evolution, and then we can just like dive in from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, for us as like a firm, like we are a generalist firm, but we're very much software focused. Like, I think it's very clear to us that like software generates the kinds of value and returns that really make venture capital work from our perspective. The tricky part, I think, is when you become too focused on any specific vertical, it makes it really easy to miss things. Right? Like, how many people are experts on mobility sort of after scooters were all the rage and then sort of stopped being all the rage, right? And how many AI funds are there now as a function of what's going on with AI? But I don't know, in 10 years from now, like, there's a very good likelihood that AI will not be a movement that is like worthwhile of having a fund exclusively for it. Like, AI will be embedded in everything. It like will be a bit of a misnomer to call yourself an AI fund. And so I think we've always avoided like this idea of like, oh, I only invest in this, I only invest in that, other than saying like, I invest in really smart people working on really interesting problems. And it turns out that like the really smart people, they're the ones that lead you to like where the opportunities are going to be. Like, we don't have the hubris of thinking like, oh, I know where the ball's going to be, or I know where the puck is going to be. We can't see the future. Like, what you can do is you can find the people who are building the future and you can ask them what they see. But you gotta have the humility to ask them and to recognize that you don't know. You gotta have the patience to sit and listen to them, talk through what it is that they're doing. And then you have to be someone who has the optimism to sort of see or believe of the world that they're trying to build. And so in many ways, like, I think this migration from SaaS to, services as a software into some of the other like business models that we see is less of a function of like my or the firm's like own ingenuity and more of an acute and innate curiosity of like where founders are going to build. And that is what we're seeing them do. That is what we're getting pitched on. That is what students are talking about when we're teaching at Stanford or in other academic institutions. And so I think that's what's driven it in terms of our interest in the space. And then I think the numbers have followed that, right? And the revenue has followed that, and the invested capital has followed those trends. But I think that's always the leading indicator. It's like, where are really smart people spending their time? Where are they going?
What's the distinction between, I guess, traditional SaaS, as we historically understand it, and services as a software, as you call it?
Yeah, sure. So originally, like that, the typical version of SaaS was usually an enterprise solution, like something that was already software, but it wasn't in the cloud. And so by pushing it into the cloud, it became this sort of subscription. It became something that you could monetize on a recurring basis. And you probably remember the old days where it was like you'd go and you just buy one version of Windows and like it'd come in 5 CDs, you load it up, and then like you were all done. You paid them, they gave you the CDs, transaction's over. And then as things moved into the cloud, they became more of a subscription function. Around those enterprise solutions in the SaaS solutions, you saw this emergence of like professional services. And these were things like configuring your operating system, or they would support, your customer support call, or, help you add a new update or a new version. What's happening now with AI is a lot of those services that surrounded the ecosystem of software, those services are starting to become their own forms of software. Things that you really only threw bodies at before because it was the only practical and cost-effective way to do it. Examples of this are, call center. It's a great example, right? Like you are, some enterprise level software, you sell somebody on a license, it's $2,000 a month for this license for some product. Something goes wrong. What do? You call customer support. And usually you get some person who maybe was in an office in, rural Pennsylvania up until 15 years ago. And eventually that moved to the Philippines, or maybe moved to India, and you're talking to someone there for $3 or $4 an hour. That person is now an AI powered agent. And that agent can be anywhere in the world. They have infinite understanding of basically all the languages and local dialects. They don't forget anything. They always remember to be polite and kind and thankful. And they always remember to, follow the policies and regulations of the firm. That would be an example of something that was a service that was being provided by a human and is now a software. Right? And at the end of the day, like AI is still software. I think sometimes we have this personification of it where we like made it into a person. It's not yet. At least not from what I can tell.
Right.
But it has a lot of attributes of a person, right? But that's a great example, I think, of, again, something that was a service that's now manifesting as a software.
That's interesting. So your understanding of the AI technology as it is that enables these services as a software, what exactly is that AI doing underneath the hood in the code of the software?
Yeah. So in terms of like LLMs.
Yeah, the LLMs that are powering these.
Sure. So like an LLM it's basically just a statistical cloud, right? So if I say to you the term peanut butter and, there's a probability that like the next word out of my mouth is going to be jelly, and there's a probability that the next word out of my mouth might be chocolate, right? And in effect, what LLMs have done is they've taken the entire corpus of English and they said, okay, here's the 40,000 words that are regularly used in English. And if I make a guess of what the next word is when someone says peanut butter and, then I can go and validate it against all this corpus of everything that's ever been written in books and everything that's ever been written on the internet and so on. And I can validate whether or not this is right or this is wrong. And so when we go through this like training process of an AI model, what we're doing is we're basically taking a whole bunch of guesses and we're just running that against this corpus of knowledge or data like that we've already sort of scraped from the internet. And it's like roughly 40 terabytes of like data. That's all the things that exist on the internet and sort of exist in that digital sense. And then based on the responses that we get in terms of the probability weighting of the next sort of, it's really technically tokens, but let's just use words here because it's a little easier. The probability of that next word being sort of jelly or chocolate, what we then do is we tune the parameters of that model until what we get out the other side is what we expect. So we know the right answer is jelly. When we guess the first time, the statistical model says, well, the next word should be chocolate. We say, that's not right. Let's turn this parameter. Let's turn it. This is the like weights and biases inside those models, right? And the number of dials that we have is what we refer to as parameters in the model. So when we talk about like a model that has, billion parameters or one that has 10 million, it's basically like a giant equalizer stereo where like you're just turning all these knobs in order to get the right sound. And once you have gotten that, you can push that into production. And that becomes GPT-5 or 4.2 or whatever the version is, right? These are all sort of like tuning mechanisms. And so what has happened in the example of a call center is someone has probably taken a large language model, like a foundation model like Claude or OpenAI or Llama or any one of sort of dozens or really like thousands of models. And they've gone in and changed the parameters. They've tuned it and turned it to be a little nicer or to be a little funnier or to have a little bit of an accent or to make sure that, it always adheres to the rules as opposed to sometimes. And once they have completed that quote unquote fine tuning, they push that out as a product. And that's really what's going into service when we think about, again, the call center or maybe an AI agent that is looking for financial fraud in a bank. I mean, all of these things are cases where you would take an existing model typically and you would fine tune it to your specific use case.
That's really interesting because I feel like that has a lot of implications in the way that we understand intelligence in general. because I guess like the value proposition is that, you know, these LLMs are quote unquote intelligent. They have some sort of knowledge, but obviously the way you described what's happening underneath the hood, like you said, it's a statistical probability, guessing that's going on, hence the model. And it's interesting because it effectively is aiming to interact with humans the same way we interact with each other. And I'm curious, like, whether or not that would be like a interesting framework to understand our own human intelligence, or is there a distinction between human intelligence and artificial LLM intelligence with respect to outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, the model is different. We have like neural networks and things of that sort. I mean, they're replicating that artificially, but is there a distinction between the two from your perspective?
I think so.
Okay.
And I think part of this debate is philosophical.
Right.
Like, it's funny, I was just thinking about this the other day. There is a case happening right now. It's a guy named Stanley Zhang, who has filed a lawsuit against the University of California system for discrimination because they've accused the UC system of using a holistic application approach, which unfairly penalizes Asian and white students who, have better academic performance according to the sort of like lawsuit. And in other words, they're saying that a merit for admittance to the UC system is and should only be a function of your academic performance. It should only be your grade and your SAT. And inherent to that argument is this bias that somehow we all agree that that's what makes you intelligent. You're only smart if you've got a great SAT score.
Right.
You're only a great student if you have great grades. And I think a more nuanced and more a more thoughtful analysis would say, well, no, I don't know if that covers the full gradient and the full spectrum of intelligence. And so I do think like there's this interesting question of does just knowing all of the facts that have existed in mankind and womankind like prior to your training cutoff date, does that actually make you smart? Does that actually make you intelligent or knowledgeable? And I don't know if that's true.
Right.
Right? Like, if we're taking it even one step further, you could look at our entire sort of human experience as being this exercise in like data compression. Right? Like, we spend the first 20 or 30 years of our lives, like basically just taking stuff that other people have thought up and trying to, squeeze and push and ram as much of that as we can into our brains through pop quizzes and through tests and through reading and through speeches and you name it. And we give little stamps and badges like every time that somebody has reached a certain compression level. And they say, okay, great, you've graduated now from middle school, you've compressed all of your times tables. Okay, now you've graduated from high school, you've compressed all of US history and the AP level of calculus. Okay, now you've compressed all of these, random coefficients, you're now an engineer. And this is how we have delved out knowledge into humans. What in effect is happening with large language models and AI more broadly is it is executing data compression at a speed and at a level that we have never experienced as humans. But again, does that make you smart because you can memorize a lot of stuff? Right? Because in effect, that's what's happening inside these models. They don't actually have context a lot of times. They don't know the nuance. They're guessing it. They're saying not this is what Collin would say, or this is what Collin is thinking, but statistically, this is what Collin or someone like him might want to say.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's a very different but important nuance. It's like small but significant difference. And so I think in that world, there is a type of knowledge that large language models are very good at, which is the way the world used to be. It is what I would call static knowledge. It's knowledge that like change. These are coefficients. This is like the gravitational field strength of the Earth.
Right.
It's been that way for a long time since, Newton discovered it, X number of years ago. What AI is not particularly good at is what I would call like perishable knowledge. It's like knowledge that is unobvious. It's not on some Reddit forum. It's not in Twitter. It's like knowledge that would only happen if you happen to be on that customer conversation at lunch, walking from the car to the office, and you found out like they didn't want to use Salesforce anymore and they were looking for a new solution. And if you knew that, it'd be really valuable to you because you knew who to sell to and what to sell your CRM product into. And if you didn't know that, you weren't there for that conversation, guess what? It wouldn't matter if you had an AI bot. It wouldn't matter if you had a whole bunch of, inference running or training models and so on. You would have missed the perishable knowledge that would have made all the difference in the world. And so I think in many ways, the world is moving to this place where your aptitude, your knowledge, your intelligence is going to be a function of like how well do you capture and utilize perishable knowledge, as opposed to like how well do you recite facts? To what extent can you quote like from the Bible or quote from textbooks and other, outliers? Malcolm Gladwell, that's a very thinking fast and slow. Like that's another one. People love to quote these books, because it kind of made you seem smart. But like, I could just say to my glasses, like, "Hey, Meadow, like, quote me something witty from." Thinking fast and slow and pretend to be smart. Right? Mm-hmm. So anyways, I think AI models are smart, but in a very specific way that doesn't fully eclipse like human intelligence and human's ability to add to the picture.
Okay, interesting. So then how does this technology then, like you said, it obviously motivates some sort of change or adaptation on the human side of things, because effectively we have a technology, while, albeit philosophically there's debate on whether or not it's intelligent or not, but its value proposition is essentially to provide intelligence or knowledge without the cost of a human being.
That's right.
So then, in your perspective, or from your perspective, what do you see to be the implications of that for the humans in the call centers that effectively are threatened to be replaced by this technology, or are likely to be replaced by this technology?
I wouldn't even call it threatened or likely. I mean, it's like already happened.
It's already happened.
Like, the numbers that I see, and at least anecdotally, the people I talk to, like that's already happening in like big numbers, like big meaning north of 25% on an annual basis, right? So it says, 4 years, 5 years from now, like most of those call centers will probably be gone. So a couple of things. One, I think that the new configuration will be like a hybrid model of your static knowledge being managed and maintained by AI. And these are the things that we used to sit in school and memorize, like the Rockwell hardness of stainless steel.
Right. Tables in the back of the book.
All of that stuff. Like that just won't be a part of being smart anymore. It won't be a part of learning anymore, because it'll all be compressed at very much higher levels than we could do as humans, like inside of these AI models. The sort of a meal that we will be bringing to the potluck as humans is this perishable knowledge. It is like the insights around things that are unobvious, that didn't happen in the digital world, things that maybe have a high EQ quotient, like things that, are derived from unique moments of inspiration or insight that maybe come from walking down the beach or like, having a conversation with a friend. Those types of things are going to be the things I think that we introduce into the picture, and the combination will be really powerful. And so I don't think everyone needs to be like an AI purveyor or AI scientist to leverage it, because in many ways, it sounds a little meta, but like the AI will generate its own AI. And so, right, like it's already like training and sort of diffusing itself into the newer models. It's teaching its little brothers and little sisters as they come along. And so I think this idea that you need to be like an AI superstar or engineer in order to be a purveyor of the technology, like that's just not true. If anything, it's becoming easier and easier for you to know nothing and still get 90% of the value out of these platforms. So there's really no excuse other than what we talked about earlier, which is like core motivation. Mm-hmm. Are you determined enough? Do you care enough to learn the things that you need to in order to have something valuable to bring to the table? And I think for people who do that, there will be infinite amount of opportunity for them. For the people who choose not to, it'll be like, I don't know, coal miners complaining about there not being, coal to mine anymore. It's like, I don't know what to do to help you.
Right.
Like those jobs are not available anymore. These are the slew of jobs that any one of which you could pick and do. You have to make that choice though.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting though, Collin, because I hear some similar perspectives around this ton of opportunity that's going to be created because the barriers have dropped significantly. Like you said, as much specialized knowledge is not really required because the static knowledge is there in the LLM, like you said. And I think about it like from, I guess, like a technology perspective, from a startup perspective, where, okay, there is an opportunity to increase supply, but demand does not always follow, right? So yes, there is an opportunity for me to jump on, the LLM, vibe code my way to an MVP. But now, as opposed to having, let's say, 100 competitors, I now entered into an environment where potentially there are 10,000, 100,000 competitors. And there's only so much demand. And I think that's kind of an argument or debate I'm seeing as well, where it's like, okay, well, now, designers can generate designs, in 30 seconds now, the graphic designs won't take that long. If they become proficient at the LLM, they'll be able to generate designs, high quality designs, and everything will be great. And they'll have much more time to do more work. And it's like, well, was the limiting factor for me as the client, how quickly you can do the designs, or was it the number of designs I actually need and I'm requesting from you as the designer, right? And so whether you can do that in 3 days or now 30 minutes, or if I have nowhere to really utilize your designs, my demand won't increase accordingly. I'll just get what I need much quicker.
Yeah.
So then in a world where that actually may be the case, the opportunity that exists is now devalued. Like most things, right? When you have, an excess of supply, the value of it goes down significantly. So is it really a true opportunity, quote unquote? Because I can perform the task now, but after completing the task, it's no longer valued the same.
Maybe what happens if we kind of take it to its extreme is that a lot of those like societal structures and business structures actually go away altogether. And what I mean by that is, we think about a logo, for example, we use that example. Like a logo is shorthand. It is a way that we have created as humans as a proxy for value, as a proxy for trust, because we don't have the ability to evaluate all the elements around it. We say to someone like, okay, you have, a Stanford degree, you must be smart, because that's what this logo means. I don't actually know if you're smart. I haven't actually tested it, but my assumption is that you are because you have this logo, right? And there's lots of firms that like just recruit on the basis of like, if you went to one of these 4 schools, we'll talk to you. If you didn't, we won't.
Right.
It's a classic example, right, of using this logo as a proxy.
Yeah.
When you start to live in a world, right, where these AI models have infinite context and where we are no longer evaluating, like I don't need to evaluate your smart. This model is going to evaluate it. This AI agent is going to figure out if you're smart or not. I don't care what school you went to. It doesn't mean anything to me other than to the extent that like you can do this job or you can't do this job. In that world, like how valuable is the logo? It's almost like everyone will be their own logo. Like it will just be representative of themselves. And so like, I think there's a bunch of these systems that exist in our current society that are artificial. Just the whole sense of like hierarchy, even like with fashion, like fashion in many ways exists as a function of status.
Right.
It's just like, okay, this Louis Vuitton bag is not worth $11,000 except for the fact that it proves to you that I have $11,000 to spend on like a faux leather bag or Birkin bag, I don't know, whatever the example is. In a world where those things are not valuable anymore because we are not the ones evaluating them. They're not coming and being like tainted through the lens of the human experience. Instead, there is like a bodyguard that's our AI agent that is saying like, yeah, you don't need those shoes. They're like, look cool, but they're actually not practical. And like, you don't need that bag because it turns out all of the, spouses or partners that you're looking for actually don't like those bags either. Right. And I can find you a better partner, than this bag might attract for you. And so I think to your question about like what happens in terms of the supply and demand of opportunities, I don't think that the demand for them goes away. I think it'll just change forms.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why I think that is because like that's what's always happened historically. Like when, like cotton gin came, like, human labor didn't go away. It just took a different form. Like rather than work the fields, you were like working the cotton gin. Right. And, when someone needed to finance that, cotton gin, like it didn't turn out that the cotton gin themselves went away. Like there became this huge industry of renting and leasing and financing like those things. And so I think the opportunity for us as humans has always been a function of our adaptability. It has not been a function of just our like intelligence. It's like, how willing are we to learn and to do the next thing? And I think for people who don't want to do that, you're right. Those opportunities, those doors are going to close. They're already closing. But I don't think it's any newer than, I don't know, when horseshoeing went away, right? Or, I don't know, whaling. That was probably another point, right? Where like people forget, like there was a point where like whaling was like 20% of the world's economy. It was like hunting these giant animals and like melting them into oil and then like carrying that around to make candles.
Right.
Like it seems so asinine in hindsight. You're like, really? Like we did that?
Right.
Like, yeah, we did that. And it wasn't that long ago. Right. So some of these things, I think we're going to look back on it. We're going to say like, wait, we took people and we stuck them in windowless rooms like for hours and every day just to answer phone calls about questions that were like clearly programmable. That seemed pretty stupid. Like, yeah, we did that,
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because I think a function of that adaptability, or perhaps adaptability is derivative of intelligence. Right?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like adaptability is certainly derivative of intelligence. To me, the intelligence comes first. The adaptability is the result or the outcome of your intelligence, right? And so when I look at, the past innovation cycles, Industrial Revolution, like I said, take it back as far as you want. This is the first technological innovation that takes away, I think, how would I say it? It doesn't take away the value of your knowledge, but it makes the value of your intelligence less consequential. And the derivative of that is a less impactful adaptability or lower likelihood of maintaining whatever state you would try to maintain in your adaptation. And so that is something that is particularly interesting to me because we're facilitating this technology. I mean, it seems like a runaway train and there's no stopping it. I mean, what OpenAI just raised, 40 billion I saw?
Yeah.
In a single grant.
Cursor, crushing it.
They're crushing it, right? Like, so it's like, it's a runaway train because I think like, it almost feels like an end game.
Yeah.
Right? It's like whoever can position themselves well now to stand or to maintain their position in a world where it doesn't matter what you know anymore.
That's right. Like the intelligence, it's no longer determinate. Like the old promise used to be if you knew a bunch of static knowledge, then you were fine. You can get a good job, white collar, you get a pension, like your job security. You did that till you were 65 and you moved to Florida, right? And that world's gone.
Yeah.
I think it's gone for a couple of reasons. Like one, there's no guarantee that like knowledge in general is going to get you a seat at the table. That just being smart or being a quote unquote knowledge worker is your ticket to the good life anymore. I mean, again, people forget there was a time where like, if you just were the big caveman, you got the good life because you could just kick everybody else's ass. And like, you took the food that you wanted and you got the partner you wanted and It was because you were big. You just had good genetics, right? There was a time where hierarchy was determined by your artistic ability during the Renaissance. Like you were a baller because you could draw really well, or like you could capture, the essence of David in marble. And so I don't think we should delude ourselves into thinking that like the era of being on top because you were smart is one that persists forever. It has not always been that way, and it's very likely that it won't always be that way. What I would submit is there is a form of knowledge that is beyond the reach of AI, which is in this realm of like perishable knowledge. It is in this realm of these like small but significant insights that you gain in the world of atoms as opposed to electrons. And you have the ability to compound on those things. That you can take these small insights that are like, these customers really like to work with folks like X or Y or Z. That insight is enough for you to go and build a business where all the other components of the business are exactly the same. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. If we look at, in the last era, Airbnb, there were lots of folks that were in the sort of home sharing like space and so on. There was couchsurfing.com. There were lots of other solutions. The small but significant insight that Brian and the rest of the team at Airbnb had was that people were willing to stay on strangers' couches or in their spare bedrooms if they had good pictures and had payments. Turns out, like in hindsight, that was, again, a small but significant insight. It was not something that you would find in an AI model. It's not something that was in some like Reddit group. It's not something that you'd read in a LinkedIn post. It was something that you'd only know if you got your ass on a plane and flew to New York with a camera and went and stayed with people for weeks on end, asking them questions, writing down the answers, and sitting there and pondering and working through it. And so I think this idea that all forms of knowledge become devalued in the age of AI is just not true. There is a type of knowledge, which we talked about, kind of this like, what's in your textbook and like, memorizing tables. Yeah, that stuff's dead. Like 100%. I 100% agree with you. There is this other set of knowledge that's always been valuable that is just becoming more valuable, right? And that's on this like perishable knowledge side. And so I think if there was one sort of place that I would push people to, is trying to push them in that direction of learning how to find those small but significant insights, learning how to capitalize on them, and then compound that again and again and again. Because I think that's going to allow you to stay out in front. It's going to allow you to create value for yourself and your family in a very persistent way, even though everything else around you is changing. I'll say one last point. I was double major in engineering at Georgia Tech. I ultimately finished with just one degree, thank God. And when I look back at like what I learned the most in engineering school, it is actually very little about like heat transfer dynamics or like digital circuits and so on. It is mostly about like how to learn. It is about like how to maintain a sense of like neuroplasticity and the ability to cram large amounts of information into my head. And I think in the same ways, like our education has to change for people who are being disrupted by AI, that the goal is not for you to learn something. The goal is for you to learn how to be learners. That you've got to be on a continual treadmill, that we've got to just get ourselves conditioned to be constantly learning new things, constantly incorporating new technologies and new ideas. That is the goal. It is not to like be really smart about how the world used to be, because that's no longer sufficient.
Excellent. And it's funny because when you were talking, I agree with you totally. This perishable knowledge idea in different forms of knowledge becoming extremely valuable in the future moving forward. And one thing I wanted to add that I thought was like really important is not only identifying those things and then acting on them and then growing and compounding them, but it seems to me like protecting them becomes very, very important forward. Because when I think about it, I think about the internet, right, was exactly, the internet is a repository of perishable knowledge.
Totally.
And AI just said, thank you, I'll take all of that.
Yep.
Now I can, you want to make Twitter? I'll make it right now in 30 seconds. It's exactly the way it looks, and everything. And it's like, okay, so then now, whatever form of knowledge then becomes the most valuable, my EQ, something that happens in the physical world. I have to be very thoughtful then on how I disseminate that digitally, because the moment I do that, it's gone now. I'm contributing to the repository of the LLM generally.
There's
right?
An expiration date too.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. So it's like, it's very interesting because I feel like I can talk about this all day.
Yeah.
It's interesting because then I think like it has implications on how we interact with each other socially moving forward. Because then, now that becomes extremely consequential, right? It's like a lot of those insights will be social in nature, or the way we perceive things, this, that, and the third. And then like, okay, if I don't feel comfortable then giving that away to the AI LLM by putting it out on the open web, right? For the AI to consume, then how do I then maneuver amongst my social group to ensure that I'm maintaining that value, protecting that value that I work so hard to create?
Well, and this goes back to sort of the Professor Dweck's sort of like growth mindset versus the scarcity mindset, right? Where it's like, if you've mastered the art of identifying and capitalizing on perishable knowledge, then you don't have this anxiety or fear of not having any more to be able to capitalize, right? It's sort of like the parable about like having a fish versus like knowing how to fish.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think the goal is to like get really good at identifying these things. They're all around us. There's all kinds of insights. Like, I used to live in San Francisco, and, there was a guy who lived on our street, who was unhoused, and a really funny guy, actually. And, people would walk past this guy and would probably not pay much attention to him and so on. And like, that's just not really my speed. So I would always chat with the dude and, make him feel like a person, like he was somebody. And lo and behold, you would be amazed to know that the dirt that this guy knew on everybody in the neighborhood. He could tell you everybody was cheating on their wife or their husband, like, and the reason why I bring that up is because even someone who seems relatively innocuous and unknowledgeable is really smart about something. And it's really just a question of like, do you have the humility to go and figure out what is this thing that this person is really knowledgeable about? All of us have perishable knowledge in us all the time. We just don't always recognize it. We don't always share it. Doesn't always get blogged or put into a book or whatever it is. And so part of it has to be like the humility and the curiosity to go and find it all around you. And so I think if you master that, then you don't have to live in this fear of like, oh, don't want to share that secret because then like I'll have to go find the next one. It's like, it should be more like eating, or it's just like you don't fear, well, for privilege, I think in the States, like in most cases, you don't fear eating such that you won't have more food coming. You just like say, okay, I'm going to eat this because I'm hungry. And when I'm hungry again, I'll eat something else. Right. Like, and I think that's where you would want people to be, or you're trying to get the population to be. But yeah, where it is right now, that's fair. I think a lot of people they're like paranoid, like, oh, don't, will you sign an NDA before we talk about my startup kind of thing? And it's like, no, we don't do that.
Exactly.
We don't do that.
Exactly. No, man, that's so good, man. Like I could chat about that forever. You have very interesting perspectives. No, seriously, it's like, it's such a interesting
hot takes.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, it's because it's so philosophical in nature.
Yeah,
right. Like nobody knows right now, and it's like, and it has a lot of implications philosophically, right? Like, I mean, like you said, just I guess like all the way back to like what is knowledge, right? Fundamentally, like this is like age old, like philosophical, topic.
Well, and it's so easy to say, oh, well, this time it's different. And it's like, well, no, it's not. It never has been. Like, there were these, nominal changes to how these things have manifested, but I think they've mostly stayed the same.
Huh.
There's this interesting book by a guy, I'm blanking on his last name, but the book is called The Rise and Fall of American Growth.
Okay.
And it's, in some ways, it's like an almanac, like from Back to the Future, like the one that like where he went in the future, he got this almanac of all the sports scores, and everyone that was going to win. And in some ways, this book takes like all the technologies from 1870 to like 1970, and it looks at like what were the like economic implications of, you know, the cotton gin and the steam engine and the telegram and the telegraph and the television and the radio. And in every era, it was like, oh no, like, what will the announcer do now that radio is here? Or like, oh, what will the ugly radio person do now that television is here? And in every one of these iterations, like these people find ways to reinvent themselves, and usually in ways that were unexpected and unobvious to them at the time. And I think in many ways, this is a testament to the ingenuity of humans as a whole. I think in many ways, if we were not that, we probably would have gone the way of the dinosaurs, or we would have been like many others in the animal kingdom that kind of, you know, became extinct. This is, in many ways, it is one of our weaknesses, but also our greatest strengths. We can adapt to things being really crappy and let them stay that way, right? It's kind of the downside of it. And then the positive side to it is like, we can adapt to make things better, right? Like we can choose to absorb the way that things are and then work to change them to the way we want them to be. And I think we have to embrace that and recognize our agency in it, rather than saying like, oh, the machines are here. This time it's different. Oh, it's not.
Well, true. Is very interesting, because I would posit there's like a third like option as well, which is destruction.
Yeah, everything just goes.
Yeah, it's just like revolution, right? It's like revolution, destruction. Like you have that third option always. It's not the most common one. Like I think, like you said, humans will live within the bounds of either trying to improve something or protecting, tolerating things that are bad for a while. But then once it gets to a point where it's clear that there's a very low margin on either side, now the question is what happens? And that's where that third option to me comes in, where it's like, okay, like if we end up in a point where, for example, because to me, it's like, it's so interesting sometimes listening to the conversations about the knowledge work, I guess, theme as it relates to AI, because it seems like many people speak from a place, not you particularly, but many people I've heard speak from a place of everyone else's knowledge is replaceable, not mine. You see what I mean? And it's like, okay, well, if I'm, for example, a COO of a company, oh no, my call center employees are threatened. You know, we'll replace them. 25%, 30% reduction in work, reduction in force. My sales team potentially, ultimately, my marketing team can go, but my knowledge as the COO of this organization, AI can't do what I can do. And to me, it's more likely that they can do your job better than you, because your job is so multifaceted, right? Like it's like you have to cover so much ground, and there's so much data you have to take in. There's no way that you're reliably optimizing your decision making. And that's something that an LLM, you know, with the proper tuning, seems to be way more proficient at that task. And so ultimately, it's like, what level does it cap out? Who ends up being protected from the effects of artificial intelligence in terms of its ability to take humans out of knowledge-related tasks in roles? And then, I guess, how do people react to that, right? Like, if you have a significant amount of people who have lost their jobs and lost their livelihoods, and who have to now adapt at the drop of a dime, because I think there's another thing, Collin, that we sometimes maybe take for granted. I think we understand it theoretically and conceptually, like, if something happens, people will adapt. We'll figure it out. And it happens just like that. There's no time, there's no delta component to this. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of the same same idea that I see with, for example, the individual who would steal bread for his family. Right? Well, because my kids are starving tonight. They've been starving for the last 3 days. Oh, well, people will say, oh, well, he could just get a job. He doesn't have to steal. Okay, what job do you know that I can get within the next 3 hours? Because my child hasn't eaten in 3 days. There's real life consequences to me not being able to provide this food. So I have a choice. Either I let my child starve, which is a philosophical question again. Either I let my child starve, or I do what I need to do. And I may take this bread because I need to do it. And so again, it's like I'm interested to see over time how we manage the fallout from this, because it's going to shift everything, like obviously, but
Absolutely.
how it shifts in the new configuration of society and who ends up accruing more power, who ends up becoming disenfranchised, even more so, or people who once had status and position in life now entering into a disenfranchised status, how that then affects the social fabric of everything would be like really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because I can see it being a huge political issue in the next like 2 to 3 cycles.
I think, if we look at like CEOs, for example, where maybe they feel a sense of security in the age of AI, and we might say, well, you shouldn't, right? Because your job is just as replaceable as anyone else's. I think the sense of security that they feel is a function of, and maybe they don't speak about it in this way, but it is that they know that they have a lock on a bunch of perishable knowledge. You look at somebody like, I don't know, Masayoshi Son and this Stargate, constellation and project that they're, saying that they're going to build in the US.
Yeah.
Why does he get that opportunity as opposed to others? It's not just a function of intelligence. I mean, you could argue any person on the planet today is probably not smarter than the sum of compute. Right. So like, just the idea that somebody exists in a certain position simply because they are smart, it almost like fails the sniff test from the very beginning. And I think it turns out that if you're a Jamie Dimon, you're not there because you're the smartest guy at JP Morgan. Like, you're there because you're very smart and you went to school with this person and you came up with that guy and you know this woman and your wife is friends with this person and you help the president with this thing and you help their so-and-so's son's cousin's brother get an opportunity at JPM. And that means that when the bank needs a new license issued in some emerging market, that you can make 2 phone calls and make that happen. Those are things that don't happen inside of an LLM, at least not today.
Right.
And it's unclear whether or not they will in the foreseeable future.
Right.
I think in many ways, like, those are human relationships and the knowledge that is derived from them, largely because they're human relationships. And if they weren't, they would have a different flavor to them. They would have a different expectation and structure. And so I think that's why those folks don't feel a lot of fear about it. I mean, I feel kind of similarly as a VC. And like, yeah, I mean, the analysis part of my job, I think an AI could do reasonably well. It turns out like a huge piece of my job is just like reading people and like figuring out like, are you going to take this thing all the way? Or, like, do you have what it takes? Do you have the grit and the tenacity? Like, are you a trustworthy person? Like, coaching them through their own like personal self-doubts and like other fights with their co-founders, you name it. Like, there are a lot of those elements behind the scenes that determine whether or not we get the big, like, outcomes, the big, vantage discovery acquisitions and that kind of thing. They're not just a function of like static knowledge or like raw intelligence. That's like EQ and relationships and calling in favors and like all of those elements. And so anyways, I think that's what's happening for those folks. Because again, if you look at it just from a raw compute standpoint, you're like, well, yeah, we're all getting replaced. Like, none of us machine can do any better than all of us. But in that hybrid configuration, right? Again, where like the static knowledge is happening inside this AI model, and then I do all the other stuff. Man, that's really powerful, right? It's like the peanut butter and chocolate bringing it full circle. You get the best of both worlds. But I do the revolution piece. I do think about a lot, and I think that the revolutions are a form of, it's people expressing their discontentment and in some ways feeling a sense of unfairness.
Right.
And I think that goes back to the whole meritocracy argument and this sort of, Stanley Jong lawsuit of, in their minds, this system was unfair because it did not privilege academic excellence in SAT scores. And there's some other set of folks who say that, like, well, no, society should organize itself around the whole person. And there's some other set of folks that say, well, like, no, society should organize itself around who can run the fastest and jump the highest. And I think there is a real conversation about who defines what meritocracy is and who's included in that conversation. And I think to the extent that people feel included in it, and we've all agreed on it, then the winning and losing within that construct are acceptable. Mm-hmm. Like, that people are willing to accept, I lost, these were the rules, like, it was fair, let's play again.
Right.
And hopefully you put bounds on the upper end and put bounds on the lower end so people, don't fall below a certain level. But I think where revolution comes from is, like, I didn't have a voice in how merit was defined, or we defined it one way but executed it another way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where people have, historically decided to pick up the pitchforks and say, wait a minute, you said this was going to be a function of working hard. I'm working 4 jobs and I can barely make ends meet. And this person is, not doing anything, not particularly smart, and, like, somehow their salary is 150 times mud. That's, I think, what you hear in people's arguments and sort of vitriol. So
yeah,
I don't know what happens, but probably won't be good. It's just, fix those.
Well, yeah, I'm believing that, there'll be an intervention way before we get to that point.
Yeah.
There'll be signs. It won't just happen overnight. But it's, like, definitely something to keep an eye on, I guess.
Yeah.
Because even, like, obviously I know we've been on this subject a long time, but it's a very fascinating conversation.
Yeah, right.
I'm enjoying it, to be honest. I hope you are too. But yeah, I think, like you said, the perishable knowledge, like you said, the Jamie Dimon example. Right?
Yeah.
Where I went to school, who I came up with, who was my mentors, right? All social things. And like you said, there's elements of unfairness to that today, right? I think the thing that keeps people from going too over the edge about that fact, because we all know that plays a role in it. And it's not necessarily, think about it, that's the whole narrative about access, right? It's like, that's a whole social component in there, right? About access to capital, access to this, access to that, right? Who matters, right?
Yeah.
We all know that this is an element, but I think, like, there's still, I think, a fundamental component of our hope in the future relies on our own intelligence, in our own grit and ability to say, I'm going to outwork somebody, I'm going to figure it out, I'm going to do these things. These are common things you hear. And then, like you said, the moment that value of that intelligence and that knowledge goes away, and it is more so this perishable knowledge that I may never get access to. Right? Because if I'm not in a room with Jamie Dimon, I can't acquire any data on him. You see what I mean? Like,
and this
I can't acquire any data on you if I'm not in a meeting with you.
Fight so hard to get to a Stanford or a Harvard or what have you. Newsflash, the physics taught at Stanford, not any different.
Exactly.
The same Utopian physics that's taught that's taught on YouTube.
Exactly.
Right? Like, the thing that you were getting is all of this perishable knowledge about who's raising money for this or this term sheet, or, like, did you know that there's going to be a tender offer for some secondaries in, like, OpenAI?
Mm-hmm.
And all of these things accrue in terms of real value and monetization and so on. And so it's strange to me because it's like, this has always existed. It's not new. This is kind of like smoke clubs and, like, country clubs and everything else. It's just becoming more and more and more important than it ever was, because all the other kinds of knowledge is now getting commoditized.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so...
and those might have been your opportunity vectors to be honest. And, like, now, if that future ends up manifesting itself, it's like real life cast starts to take form, because that perishable knowledge is not going to leave that.
That's right.
You see what I mean? Like, because it's so valuable.
And I guess my argument is, my belief is, if you look closely, it doesn't just exist within Stanford and so on. Like, it exists within circles of people, whether it's you as a founder and customers that you're talking to, whether it's small groups of employees, whether it's sitting in the lobby of some conference, which is literally where the name of our firm, like Lobby Capital, came from. Like, the real perishable knowledge was not happening sitting in an auditorium listening to someone talk at a TED Talk. Hornick was like, no, the real conversation is happening in some corner of the lobby with a bunch of random nerds who were all sitting in the audience. And it turns out collectively they know more than the person who was giving the keynote. And how do you inspire that conversation? How do you create structure for that to happen on a regular basis? And so my point is, like, in the case of, again, Brian and like Nate and those guys with Airbnb, none of them went to Harvard. None of them went to Stanford. They still understood where to look and how to find perishable knowledge, how to find these small but significant insights, and then take those and capitalize on it, right? And the example I give sometimes on, like, the compounding front, hopefully this makes sense, but, you know, I used to follow, like, sprinting. I have this nephew who is, I think he's the fastest, 60-meter runner in the country now. It's like under 18. He's just, like, exceptional. He's top of his class at Exeter. Trying to get him to go to Stanford, but he's like, I don't know if he's going to go. But anyways, when you think about, like, Olympic level or elite running, there's two input vectors, right, on how fast you can run. One is, like, how fast your feet turn over, right? It's turnover speed. And the second is your stride length. You take the two of those things, you multiply them together, and that tells you how fast someone's moving down the track, right? And it's just where the speed comes from. And so you look at, you know, the sort of fastest runners in the world, your Asafa Powell's, your Tyson Gay's, your, like, Usain Bolt's, and you look at their turnover speed of their feet, it turns out the turnover is not different. It's, like, almost the same, because from a physics standpoint, there's kind of a critical speed, a critical limit to how fast you can move your feet to, like, turn them over, right? Now, the big difference, though, is if you look at them from a height standpoint, Usain Bolt, 6'5", and it turns out that each one of his strides are like 2.5 to 3 inches longer than everybody else who's lining up on the blocks. And so what does that mean? It means that, like, there's this small but significant insight that's literally only 2 inches, right? And when you step out of that blocks, they take that first, bound out of the blocks. Usain Bolt's only 2 inches in front of everybody else. It's, like, not really a big deal. From the cameras on the TV, they all look neck to neck or chest to chest. But then he takes the next step, and now he's 4 inches ahead. And then the next step, and now he's 6 inches ahead. And by the time he's gone over the 150 cycles from the beginning of the race to the end of the race, he's now, 20 feet in front of the next closest competitor. He's absolutely dominated. And he hasn't dominated by having a 20-foot bound out of the blocks. He dominated by having a 2-inch difference that he just compounded on over and over and over and over and over again. And so my point is, I think sometimes people miss these perishable insights all around them, this perishable knowledge all around them, because they're looking for these, like, big, massive, like, differences. And they're 2-inch differences. It's like, no, the Airbnb thing, it's just like everything else you've seen. It's basically couch surfing. It has better pictures and may have payments. Oh, and then you compound on it, and you have better protections, and you have better insurance, and you now have better employees, you have a better office. All that is a function of compounding on that sort of, like, 2-inch advantage. And so I think, again, as people are training themselves to look for these small but significant, necessarily small but significant, right? If they weren't small, then everyone would see them. They wouldn't be valuable, right? Like, they have to be kind of small and innocuous, but they turn out to be significant. And if you find those and you're compounding on them, it's very easy for you to win the race. Like, this is why Usain Bolt could, like, look at the camera and, like,
right.
He's like, I'm doing the really, I only have to add 2 inches every time I, like, take a step.
Right.
That's all I got to do.
Right.
And then I win the race by 20 feet. Like, great. I did all day long.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, and that's a good transition into I guess what it takes now for founders to build.
Yeah.
When we talked, a week or so ago, you shared this idea of, like, malleable software. in this new age of artificial intelligence and building startups, building software in the age of artificial intelligence. So can you define malleable software?
Yeah, sure.
Help me understand it as a concept.
So if we're like denerdifying it for a second, like in the study of metallurgy, like there is a characteristic of metal that is called like malleability. And it's literally like how easy is it for you to pound out a piece of metal? Like how easy is it for you to bend it and to shape it? And so the term refers to this idea of it becoming like increasingly easier to like shape or bend the existing corpus of software. So the way software existed in the past was you would collect a bunch of specifications and requirements from a client or from a customer or from interviews. You would turn that into specs, and then you'd go and you'd build all this stuff for 3 months or 6 months or whatever the time period was. You'd release it out into the wild, maybe you do a little testing. And once you released it, you'd immediately start collecting bugs, like things that you thought were going to work one way or another, whether it was UI or whether it was actual like logic. And as you accrued a certain number of bugs, you'd then go back and you would work on this software again, and you'd release an update or a patch or a new version of it. And so you went through this process that we literally call the software development lifecycle, right? Like SDLC. And this process could be anywhere from like 6 months to, a year and a half in some cases. And in each of those stages of the SDLC, like you would basically have a hard stop and a pause before you started the next step. You would finish, coding, and then you'd go into QA, you'd finish QA, and then you'd push to production. You would be in production while you collected bugs until you went back into coding. What is happening today with AI agents, specifically around like software engineering agents, is they are reducing the amount of time it takes for you to modify the code, to QA the code, and to push it into production. And it's reducing the number of bugs that you find, right? So in the sort of while the code is in production. And so what that means is the software development is becoming more organic, it's becoming more dynamic, where it's just continually updating, right? Where it's maybe asymptotically approaching the ability to just update on an ongoing basis, right? And I say asymptotically because there might be a limit to it, but I don't know yet. But it is very clear that like what was a 3-month development cycle is now becoming a 3-week cycle. What was a 1-week QA cycle is now maybe 1 day, right? And what would have been found in production as far as bugs is getting found at the QA level, right? And so if you follow that trend where the software cycles get smaller and smaller and smaller, at some point it just becomes a continuous development. Like you're just building new stuff and like constantly launching it. And there is no like pause. There's no versioning. It's just like literally just like, no, the software just got better, just got better, just got better, just got better. You don't even bother having numbers to look at versions because what would be the point? You never go backwards. You wouldn't need to. The software would just evolve on its own. Similar like, maybe human, genetics. Like we don't try to evolve. We just do.
Right.
Every generation, in theory, some change happens at the genetic level. And in the cases where it gets better, it stays. In the cases where it doesn't get better, as measured by whatever, it doesn't stay. Right. So malleable software sort of refers to, that trend where, again, software is starting to move and evolve on a dynamic and continuous basis.
Okay, interesting. And so what are the implications then, I guess, from a client or customer standpoint, whether that's an end user of the software or an organization that purchasing software? And then what does that mean for founders and startups?
Sure. So I think it changes a lot of the economics of like how software is provided. So if you think about sort of the original version of software, right, where you were writing it and you'd sell someone again like 5 CDs from, Microsoft, at that point, like the development of that software was paused. You'd send out those 5 CDs, and then like the transaction was done. There wasn't necessarily a need to continue developing it until you were going to release the next version. And at the same time, you kind of had to over provision that software because you were going to do one release and it was going to have to be the standard for everyone. So you needed to cover all the use cases with this like one version that you put out. And even as software moved to the cloud, like it still had the same form factor of like, there is one version of Salesforce. Now you can take it and twist it and turn it and tweak it, but like ultimately it's all built on the same sort of fundamental corpus. What I would argue is as malleable software is becoming more the standard, or as things are being built from scratch to be infinitely configurable, that the idea of like overbuilding software all of a sudden stops making sense. Like you don't really need to build expansive software and then configure it. Like in theory, you would just build the software that you need for every bespoke case because the cost of customizing it is effectively zero, right? I give you one sort of funny analogy. I was studying abroad my sophomore year of college in China, and it was like kind of a weird time to be in China. It's the early 2000s. Americans were like very popular in China at that time because there just weren't a lot of us like there. And, China was becoming this hotbed of textile and manufacturing and so on. And it was really, really cheap to like manufacture shirts and hats and clothes and so on. And so we started off, we'd go to the market and you'd like buy a shirt and so on. And at one point we realized like it was cheaper to buy new clothes than it was to wash them. So we were like regularly buying clothes every week. And then at some point we realized like, well, wait a minute. It's so cheap to have custom clothes made. Why would we ever buy, a Ralph Lauren polo shirt? We just design our own shirts. We're just going to go to the cloth market and we literally would just design shirts every week. And it was all because like the cost of designing a shirt from scratch that was custom fit, custom fabric, custom collar was at or below the cost of buying like a Ralph Lauren polo. You just started buying all of your clothes basically custom made. And I think it's an analog for sort of how software is going to be here is that like, in effect, you're not going to buy a Salesforce CRM that's going to be configured to your business. Like you're going to buy a CRM that's in effect built for your business. And it might have building blocks that come from Salesforce, but it also might have some building blocks that come from Rippling and some that come from, some open source library from Meta. And so I think that's going to be this like fundamental change, is like we're going away from, sort of custom built, homes that are maybe built from scratch, and instead they're being assembled from lots of like pre-manufactured.
Yeah, like some modular homes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it'll look like that. And we'll see. But like that's my guess.
That's really interesting because given, I guess, how easy, relatively speaking, it is to now customize things, and I mean, obviously much cheaper to customize things. How do you think organizations will make a decision on whether to build or buy now, when they also can presumably, some organizations will have the capabilities to provision their own software internally, as opposed to buying, bespoke software from a third party?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I think we all had a lot of faith in the concept of comparative advantage until Trump started tariffing. And now it's like, it's kind of the first test in a long time that we've had of like, at what point does it make sense to try and make everything yourself? And I think that the fundamentals are going to hold true, and we're going to find out that's a really bad idea. That like you, in effect, want to make the things that you are uniquely suited to make and that you have a comparative advantage at. And I think the really smart companies in countries are going to recognize that, and they're going to double down on it. If you're, Apple, you manufacture an iPhone for $150 and you sell it for $1,500. Now the question becomes like, do you want to be Foxconn, where you manufacture the phone for $125 and sell it to an Apple for $150? Or do you want to be the Apple that like designs the phone and licenses all the technology and so on, and then makes it for $150 or buys it for $150 from Foxconn and sells it for $1,500? plus a whole suite of softwares and licenses and other things like subscriptions that people buy. I think the economists would say like that is the part of the curve that you want to play on. And something very similar happens within, I think, companies where you've got to make this decision of, is the marginal time and energy in your business better suited to you doing more of the thing that is special and unique and comparatively more advantaged than those around you? Or do you want to spend it trying to do my job, right? Whether it's building a CRM or whatever other product I'm offering. I think you're seeing companies increasingly outsource those things. If nothing else, like they are outsourcing the like components of it, and maybe they're doing the assembly internally. But I think it will be a losing strategy to try and build all of the building blocks yourself from scratch, even with AI.
That's really interesting. Because as you're describing that, I'm thinking in my mind, I self-taught programmer myself. So it's like, okay, it's like essentially the choice of whether or not to use a library.
Right? Yeah, totally. And when do you not use a library?
Right, exactly.
You're like, why would you?
Because it's a problem that's already been solved. I don't need to create my custom solution. Like this will do, this function will do, this component will do. And yeah, I could just take that from the library and then use my own configuration of that component or whatever the case may be. And it's really interesting to think about as well, because I think thematically the whole conversation is like centered around, I guess, like even in this topic still, it's like this idea of like, okay, now I have access to intelligence or knowledge, and now where I lacked comparative advantage, I've now gained capability.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I may not have a large comparative advantage, but I'm less disadvantaged than I was before.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So like the calculus changes a little bit as I'm thinking about that decision. And it's like really interesting to think about, because at the end of the day, I wonder if there's like an asymptotic relationship as well between how much we outsource and how much we have a desire to build in itself, which is back to what we talked about at the beginning, right? It's like, who has the agency, who has drive, who has the drive to do it. Hey, if I just invest like $1 million or $2 million, in my dev team and get, a few more engineers that can now 10x, my internal tooling, then perhaps I can save $30 million, or $10 million or, $20 million on outsourced software. And so is that something that ultimately the opportunity cost of me not having agency, of me not putting in the work to do that will be so great that I'll start turning to that option more and more, as opposed to, going and outsourcing from, a organization who presumably has a comparative advantage, but in fact is really just leveraging expanded capabilities due to AI themselves. You see what I mean? So it's like, if anything, why not just acquire that team and then bring them internally?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And like, again, I don't think there are new concepts in that.
Yeah,
like we all know like really brilliant people who haven't done shit with their lives.
Very true.
Right?
Very true.
I look at myself and like, I think very little of what I've been able to accomplish in my career is a function of just like being the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah.
Like most of the rooms I'm in, I'm not the smartest guy.
Yeah.
Like it has come down to that desire to like, you either want to win or you don't.
Right.
And at some point, the person who's opposing you, or the structure or entity that's opposing you on that front, like realizes that you're not going to quit and says, all right, well, fine. You could have it, right? Like, and I feel like that's a lot of, what happens, whether it's within an organization or whether it's happening to us personally and professionally. And so, I think these companies and organizations are going to have to figure out like, what battles do you want to take on? And again, the traditional sort of Clayton Christensen approach would be like, you want to find the element that you are uniquely suited to be able to deliver, and you want to innovate on that. You want to innovate on your competitive advantage, right? And everything else, you should borrow, you should buy, you should steal, like whatever it is, steal ethically. And,
right. Be inspired.
Be inspired by, yeah. But like that should be your approach. Like the goal is not to over provision and redo things that have already been done or created or invented. The goal is to do as little as possible for as much as possible, as often as possible. It's like literally the American way, which I think is ironically like most personified or exemplified by like the Chinese food restaurants in Chinatown, where it's like the sort of styrofoam clamshell. It's like the cheapest possible container you can put food in, with a ton of rice and then like a bunch of chicken kung pao that has a bunch of breading on it, that literally has like the smallest amount of chicken inside of the breaded bits that you would need to be able to call it chicken.
Right.
And they give you the crappiest possible fork that's 1 or 2 pennies, right? Like, because at the end of the day, like the purveyors of those restaurants, they understand the goal is not for me to build you the best meal that I can build you. It is to do the least amount possible for you to say you were full and you ate something resembling food, and to charge you as much as I possibly can for it. And so that principle, which I would argue again is like sort of the American principle, is very much like what has to be pushed into these organizations. Like the goal here is not to over provision. The goal here is to do as little as possible for as much as possible, as often as we possibly get.
Let me check time.
Yeah, sure.
Make sure we're good. It looks like we hit time. So last question for you, just to kind of round it out. I think it was an interesting topic we had, where you had like an really interesting perspective on in our prep call, which is just, are we entering into prosperity? And assuming we are, the prosperity that will materialize in our society or in tech, period, within startups, venture capital, however you want to frame it, the scope. What's the utopian perspective on that?
I mean, I think we have a decision to make. And I think there's a mammalian brain and a reptilian brain that we have had that has created artificial scarcity. It's created artificial hierarchy. We've always done it. Monkeys have done it. Other animals do it. Penguins. And as smart as we've gotten, we've been unwilling to dispense with that. We still look at things through the lens of race and class and status and redlining and premium and sub-premium business class and economy, or, basic economy. And I think if we continue to go down that path, then the world gets really murky, because that type of world only exists if you can keep the ignorance persistent enough for people to allow themselves to be relegated to one of those rungs versus another. And this is what happened during slavery, and this is what happened during, the French Revolution, that at some point, like, people got smart. At some point they realized, like, wait a minute, this is not fair. This is not right. And it always ended in revolution. It always ended in sort of war and despair. What I would argue is, like, with AI, people's ability to get smart on what's really happening is higher than it's ever been. That you're not going to be able to keep the unfairness secret. You're not going to be able to keep the artificial hierarchy and the scarcity, or the reality that, like, half the world's starving and we're dumping like millions of tons of grain into the ocean every year. Like, that's not going to be a secret anymore. And one place that I've seen this already like manifest is like when you look at sort of foreign-born founders. Like, there was a time where people who are now like foreign-born founders would have come here and they would have been a mid-level engineer. at IBM. I'm just using them as an example, but and they would have created tens of millions of dollars or maybe hundreds of millions of dollars of value, and they would have been paid $100,000 a year. And they would have been really happy to get $100,000 a year because back in India, they would have made X number of rupees, or in China, they would have made X number of renminbi. And this is a much better opportunity than what I would have had at home. Therefore, I should be grateful, keep my head down, work hard, and then I'll send money back home and everyone will thank me. Now, all of those people who would have been engineers, the message is out. They all recognize, like, wait a minute, I can go build DeepSeek, and I don't have to do it in the States. I can just go do it in China. Or I can go build Zomato or, any one of a dozen other companies in India or wherever else. And as that has happened, you've seen sort of our ability as Americans to have a stranglehold on innovation and on, knowledge sort of dissipate. My point is, I think you will see the same thing happen within a society, whereas all the folks who are traditionally disadvantaged through the tax code or through redlining or other sort of means of keeping them at bay, that they're going to start getting smarter a lot faster, just like everybody else is getting smarter as a function of AI. And when they come to the conclusion, or if they come to the conclusion that things are not fair, have not been fair, and don't have any intent to be fair, and they're going to get the pitchforks. And I think that is a world we don't want. And so, to your original question, I think the utopic view is that we as a society come to the conclusion that some of these things are stupid. Education should not be something that's rationed out as a function of having money or living in a certain zip code, right? Like intelligence or the ability to sort of take care of yourself at a very basic or fundamental level shouldn't be a function of just whether or not you had the genetic disposition to be able to have, high memory or neuroplasticity. You should be able to get a good job just because you're a person and because you're valuable in one way or another. And so, again, I think we've held it up to be that all of these things are because they have to be that way. It has to be a good school so that there can be bad schools, or there has to be people who are poor so there can be people who are rich. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
And so I think the utopic version of AI is we all get smart enough to realize that things we've been doing are kind of stupid and that we should do them differently. And I think if that happens, there's going to be a ton of value created for everyone. There should be more than enough to go around. So that's kind of my hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that, man. I appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, of course.
Like we hit times, we respectful at the time. But brother, this was fantastic.
Absolutely.
Enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah.
Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.